wonder, I accept that the EU has finally woken up and finally is getting its act together a bit more. But weren't you being a bit kind on the reaction at the beginning? I mean, I was reading the other day something written by a former EU Commission official now working for the Wilfred Martin Centre for European Security, where he contrasted the speed of the UK's response with that of Europe and said if the Ukrainians were relying on the EU, the war might be already over and we would be looking at a weakened, dismembered Ukraine. Isn't the reality that the EU was very slow initially?
Absolutely. I mean, the EU is many things. I don't think I ever accused it of being nimble. The fact is the EU got to the right place eventually. And in a sense, if I sounded positive, it's because my bar is generally very, very low for the EU when it comes to foreign and security policy matters. So in that sense, for me, they exceeded expectations by arriving in the right place. But you're absolutely right. I mean, an individual state is going to be able to act with more agility in responding to these sort of things than an organisation that requires consensus amongst 27 to be achieved before action can be taken.
Lord Hannay.
Yes, could we now look at this issue of whether or not it makes sense to think in terms of a strategic framework between the UK and the EU? Just to recall, I'm sure you both of you are well aware, firstly that of course this was envisaged in the political declaration that was signed by the UK and the EU before the UK left or Brexit took place and was then dropped by the Johnson government. But it's there on paper, agreed by both sides. Secondly, I'm sure you're aware that this committee, in the report that it produced at the end of April, has recommended to the government that they should now take this up again and proceed with it. I wonder if, operating within the framework of those two facts, you could first of all say whether you think that is a good idea, and secondly, what sort of areas, technical areas like the coordination of sanctions, high geopolitical strategy areas like the relationship with China or Iran, as well as that with Russia. And so could you perhaps say something about both those sides of things and anything else which you thought ought to be included within such a structured framework if you think that that would be a step forward from where we are now? Anand, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the way I think about this is to ask myself what would have happened more effectively in terms of UK cooperation with the EU if we had signed up to something like we'd agreed to in 2019, if we'd had that security agreement. And actually, the answer I always come to is not very much at all. So in many ways, this relationship works pretty well in a time of crisis between the two. Now, the kind of advantages you get from a formalised agreement, I think, will be more regular meetings between the two sides, sort of institutional meetings between officials and between ministers, I think would be a good thing. Above and beyond that, the real issue for me, I think, concerns the sort of the more economic sides of security. That is to say, I think I mentioned the European Defence Fund before. On areas like that, it is very striking that whilst the European Union is happy to talk about cooperation and alliance with the United Kingdom, it is absolutely adamant about excluding third countries from things like the armaments initiative it has taken and the European Defence Fund. I think that is potentially damaging both for the UK in the medium term should these things become serious, and indeed for Europe as a whole, because increasingly, and particularly in the case of another Trump presidency, Europeans are going to have to look to themselves a lot more and work together a lot more closely. So that's I mean, in a sense, the key area where I think I would like to see some sort of an agreement is an area where the European Union at the moment is unlikely to agree to any such thing.
Yes, and presumably, I mean, we are doing a report on Ukraine, so your answer is very Ukraine-centric. It wouldn't perhaps be so obvious that we would come together on, say, relationship with China without a structured framework.
Again, I wonder. I mean, we spend, our political leaders interact with their counterparts, particularly from the larger member states in many fora, where they can talk about matters such as China and coordinate on matters such as China. I'm yet to be convinced that a formal security relationship with the European Union would make much of a substantive difference to our ability to coordinate like that. I know we disagree on this, Lord Hannay.